Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today, I have the pleasure of Madeleine Evans. Welcome, Madeleine.
Hi, Julie.
Good to see you. And I'm just going to tell the audience a little bit about you. So you're an investor, you're an entrepreneur, and you've got a lot of experience in driving transformation and growth across corporates and sort of startup companies. You're also the founder and CEO of Level, a productivity and well-being app uniquely designed for the modern day workforce, which I'm sure we will come to later on, because we're going to be talking about how we eliminate burnout. But before we get into that, I want to ask, what do you love about what you do, Madeleine?
Such a good question. And I think we'll probably come on to this, but certainly having had my own experience with everything related to burnout and the consequences. One of the key insights for me off the back of that was I want to be in control of my day to day, and I want to be able to do what's called craft my job, right?
And wow. Craft my job. I've never heard that term before. That's a new term.
Okay, we'll get into it. Job crafting. Yeah, one of the burnout engagement literature key solution also to burnout and prevention, and be able to choose exactly how I spend my time every day. And it's that freedom, aligning my day, my tasks to the things that really motivate me, the things that I value, the people that I want to work with, the missions that matter, which gets me so excited. And of course, there are lots of other things which we can get into, but I would say, yeah, the freedom of building a mission-driven business that's super aligned to your values with people that you love is what I love about what I do.
Perfect. That's brilliant. And it's interesting because we all strive to have gain that alignment when we work for organizations. And like yourself, I've created my own organization and aligned to my own values, beliefs, and mission as well. So it's exciting and fulfilling, rewarding, hard work at times, and but it's great. We are going to be talking burnout, and I've had other people on here talk about burnout, and I think it's a real important topic right now. I'd be just curious to understand from your perspective, do you think the pandemic, it sounds a really obvious question, do you think the pandemic has made burnout worse or not?
It's not a really obvious question, actually. Statistics say yes.
Right.
Statistics say the pandemic has made burnout worse for a couple different reasons. There was a great microsite series of studies published actually recently in HBR that noted that 89% of people felt that their work-related well-being, so how I feel about work, which burnout is one of those things, has deteriorated during COVID-19. We can kind of get into the details of that, but and the psychology around why key reasons that are being cited by individuals that I would cite is lack of boundaries or lack of perceived boundaries, not understanding when I should stop work and when I can take time for myself, and also feeling potentially a lack of support or a little bit of lack of community, since you're also not in the same place as your colleagues.
Yeah.
Are two factors that contribute to effectively what is increased demands, fewer resources, which is what drives strain, which ultimately accumulates into burnout over time.
So the whole remote working, although deemed as a real positive thing, people wanting flexible working on their own time, no commute, potentially, if not handled well, is creating more opportunities or more unfortunate burnouts time, I guess, with people.
It's a really interesting point, actually. So what remote working does is it gives you a lot more control. So the shift in locus control from the company to the individual. All of a sudden, I decide when I start work, when I end work, I create my environment. Do I have interruptions, distractions, or not? But also it takes me away from my workplace community, at least physically, right? So these two things change. How you respond to that then determines whether that increases your risk of burnout or decreases it, which has to do with things like self-awareness, self-management skills, and also the culture and practices of the team and the wider organization with which you work.
Okay. And so in terms of, it'd be good for the audience to understand, how do you define burnout? Because we have stress, and we have stress in life, and we have burnout, and they're different, aren't they? Or are they different? Or is there a continuum going along here?
It's interesting. It is a bit of a continuum. So, I mean, gosh, burnout has actually been, this is first time identified around the 60s, 70s in the healthcare industry. There's been decades of research on burnout.
Really? Because to me, it feels, and I might, just because I'm a bit more aware of it now, it feels like a new thing in the last, I don't know, 10 years perhaps. Or is that it's just become more media new, or is that what it is, rather than it has been around for a while? Clearly,
been around for a long time.
Yeah. As in, is that obviously in terms of jobs, I appreciate that, but in terms of people's understanding of burnout, has it been around for that long, do you think? As 40 years?
Ask Christina Maslach. So one of the foremost academic researchers and authors of burnout, and kind of pioneer of the Maslach burnout inventory, which is how one can also measure using a validated scale burnout in the workplace, has been publishing on this topic for absolute decades. But there hasn't really been the media attention has spiked during COVID. I think that the work that's been done to lay the groundwork around awareness of mental health, although burnout is not actually anything particularly to do with mental health. So it's, the WHO classifies burnout as, rather than a medical condition, an occupational related syndrome, effectively. Okay. But I think media attention has increased. I mean, even in the first quarter of 2021 this year, you had The Atlantic, you had the FT, you had HBR, all publishing pretty big pieces on the burnout crisis, just starting to bring to the level of public awareness things that academics have known for decades about what characterizes burnout, or what drives it, and then what you can kind of start to do if you want to make change. Okay. So just going back to your point, so burnout is a psychological syndrome as a result of prolonged exposure to chronic stressors and interpersonal stressors or emotional stressors in the workplace. Right. And the root is effectively this process of prolonged both like stress in terms of feelings of lack of control, but then also just strain. It's diagnosed in terms of the symptoms with 3 dimensions. So it's multidimensional. It's also a spectrum condition, which means you can be like more or less burnt out depending on how frequently you feel certain things. And we look at exhaustion, so emotional, but also physical, deep cynicism, so frustration or an anger or leading to a detachment or jadedness, and then ultimately what's called kind of inefficacy, which is both a deterioration in objective performance potentially, but also in feelings like you are not worthy or you can't do it, and kind of a degradation of one's own self-worth. And yeah, and
would you, I know those measures, do you tend to, it's important to spot all of those aspects? Because obviously you mentioned something about getting frustrated, angry, because that can come out in response to change. And you get the change curve, and you get that point where people get angry, cross, and that's a healthy thing in terms of managing change and being aware of it. So it's important to spot all those other factors in people to ensure that you're spotting burnout rather than just a response to perhaps change, I guess.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a temporary thing, right? There's change resistance, so pushing back on something. That's like the natural part of the process. Burnout is really a result of this kind of prolonged process, chronic stressors and chronic strain. And the way I kind of like to talk about it, or like a natural process that you might see or feel, right, is it's usually with motivated people. So you're putting a lot of effort into your job. You can also be highly engaged and highly exhausted. So you can basically be engaged and either burnt out or on your way to to burning out. They're completely different processes. So
Interesting.
motivated, I'm engaged in my work, I'm working really hard, right? Putting a lot of effort into my job, and it's stressful, you know. I'm working hard.
So how do you spot that? If you see somebody who's performing really well, putting a lot of work in, how do you spot a point of potential burnout? What are you sort of, what's telltale signs that make it really clearly that they are into burnout?
Yeah, so this is a super interesting point, which is that where a lot of companies are focused on engagement, and engagement surveys completely missing the early signs of burnout, because you don't have the second lens, which looks at the individual's emotional profile, emotional well-being. Things that people might say are, you know, I'm working quite a lot, I'm quite busy. I might start to feel a bit more fatigued and tired. I might not get enough recovery that I need, so I might actually be showing up to work tired.
Right. Okay.
And also say things, okay, I'm feeling a bit stressed. So fatigue, stress are early signs. That can start to shift. And it's a really interesting piece whereby if you're not getting enough recovery and you feel like your organization's not listening, you're starting to get a bit frustrated.
Okay.
And you can see that then in individuals' emotions, right? You can also see them how they're reacting to things. And then that can turn into kind of anger and lashing out, or it can turn into unhappiness and low mood. And then ultimately you'll either see, I mean, you won't kind of know that unless you're having that conversation, that engagement around the individual's emotions and how they're feeling. You'll see someone either detach, so just decide, forget it. I'm done with this. Motivation drops, engagement drops. You'll see a breakdown. Someone will ask for stress leave, or someone will just leave the company. So it's super important to actually be looking at both, not only trying to spot the emotional signs and feelings of people, but also empowering people to understand themselves so that they can themselves become aware of where they are in that process early days.
Yeah, it's important to create that sort of self-regulation, isn't it? That self-awareness, so people can spot it. But I think it goes back to leaders being really having conversations, really engage with their teams, and building those relationships that they can, monitor the sort of emotional states, the language they're saying, their motivation, and all that sort of stuff. And then that's more difficult in a remote sense. And I guess that's perhaps why it's been exacerbated, because it's harder to spot sometimes. And I know I've had people on this show who've talked about how to really create that more engagement in the context of remote. And it is more challenging, but it still can be done. I'm curious, and it feels like going back to the beginning here, but you're very passionate about burnouts, and you've obviously done a lot of research into it in terms of what you've just been sharing. I'm just curious, how did you get into burnout? What was the attraction, if there was an attraction to it? And it'd be curious to understand of the reasons why you focused on burnout and sort of well-being.
Yes, I'll get into that. I also wanted to just pick up on something that you said, which was interesting about leaders and managers having conversations. I think one of the things that to be mindful of is that managers and leaders are themselves not necessarily emotionally aware or able to labor or recognize or have that level of emotional intelligence. The conversations can be very difficult. Do I actually want to tell you that I'm tired? Because does that mean that you'll think less of me? Does that mean that I might be at risk of not getting that project, that I might then potentially lose my job? And the remoteness. So there are a lot of reasons why actually the face-to-face dialogue is something that is actually not what companies should be relying on. It's important. It's great if you have those skills and you have the time, but it's unlikely to actually give you kind of the information that you need. So yeah, let's talk about my own. So I've definitely had my own experience. I've experienced the whole spectrum. Very stressed, very exhausted, then very frustrated, and then ultimately deciding that I've had enough and I'm going to leave my job. I would not recommend it for anyone. It's very stressful, not the least stressful, but you don't necessarily, and this is sort of part of what ultimately I'm championing, is like And this is kind of 4 years ago for me. Just zero public understanding about what this means and what the science might be, and total taboo against talking about that. And so I was kind of, left a little bit to my own devices with that. And I didn't even recognize it. I mean, wouldn't even know what to call it in my of itself. But what happened is
was it more of a retrospective of realizing
retrospective diagnostic?
Yeah. So I've been through all, I've done that. Oh, that's what it was. It was burnout.
Yes, but it's a joke really, because there are something called mismatch theory, which looks at kind of key contributing factors to burnout at a kind of structural or state level. And one of the things is job control, high demands, that there's lack of community, fairness, values alignment, and effort reward. And if I kind of go through all of that and I would look back at my old job, on the face of it, excellent, delivering on projects, success, a lot of job characteristics, the way that job was designed, talking about job crafting, that actually would reflect really high risk factors for burnout. And then, of course, in retrospective, also, I can diagnose my own experience a little bit here. And I've seen that pattern happen time and time again. It's really funny. I mean, the number of people I've been chatting to, just a friend of mine, just for example, is over we met kind of for a walk, and I was explaining this, and he goes to me, so what is actually burnout anyway? And I was saying, exhaustion, and then you get this kind of cynicism, this jadedness, and then ultimately you start to feel this lack of efficacy. And he's just like, interesting, okay, tell me more about that. And he's like, I think that might be burnout. Do you think that's burnout? And I said, well, let's go through this, right?
Interesting.
This has happened to me time and time again. We're just hearing someone talk about their experience triggers an understanding on the part of the person listening. It's like, oh yeah, interesting. Yeah, oh, okay, that describes why I left my past job. And you're like, right, okay, we need to be much more aware of this, and then we need to be able to take early action so that it's better for the person, for the company, for that divorce not to happen, for that person to continue to be performing or even level up their performance through greater self-awareness. It's beneficial for them in their career as well.
So what was, having gone through burnout and then realized you had it afterwards, and what was the passion? What created the passion to sort of pursue it and understand it more, and then obviously to help other people? Where did that come from?
I think I'm a problem solver by nature, and I think I'm a investigator and a researcher by nature as well. So one of the things that I love most is understanding the details of something and distilling it into something that makes it a lot more simple, and starting to communicate that. Of course, also I thought, just looking at the facts of number of people that experience these types of early symptoms. So we did a survey actually with Level back in 2018, a workforce survey of US and UK workers, found that 70% of people felt at least sometimes stressed, exhausted by their work, around 30-40% feeling that more frequently. And then you get kind of 10 to 15% of people who are feeling severe symptoms relatively consistently. And the same thing goes for lack of motivation and frustration as well. And so it's clearly a big problem. So that was the first point. Okay, this is a big problem. This is like not just me, this is a lot of people that are feeling this. The second is, what are the impacts? I knew from my own personal experience, extremely costly chronic stress in the workplace impacts your health, can impact your career performance, impacts things like creativity, right? And so there are obviously costs to this, and that's creating an ongoing tax effectively, right, on individual performance and on company performance that we're not identifying where we're having these early signs and fixing them. And I want to see people achieve their full potential. I want to see companies achieve their full potential. So it seemed like an obvious thing to target. Brilliant. As a place to spend my time. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. And it's great that you've come from that experience which I think really gives you a lot more credibility. And not that you have to have experienced it to solve the problem, but I think it really helps when you talk about the stories. And you made an interesting point there about when you start to share your stories, or other people share their stories, and people start to recognize and feel and can identify it. as opposed to just putting a definition of what burnout is, as you start to explain it. And that person said, well, actually, I'm feeling like that. Am I in burnout? And that creates that opportunity to have a conversation, which brings me back to, you mentioned before when we talked about how we try and check in on our teams, and you think that's probably not always the best place or the most effective way because of people are not always honest or happy to share if they're feeling stressed or overwhelmed. So what would be the best way of understanding from your team whether they're in a burnout situation or potential burnout before they get to it?
So it's an interesting point, actually, and I wanted to pick up on one particular point, which is that burnout, or the potential for burnout, the risk of burnout, is sort of a side effect of high performance and stressful environments. And so this is something that we're sort of, if you are living in a world where you're pushing, you're motivated, it's competitive, there's just always something you have to watch, right? This dynamic balance between demands and work, the effort I'm putting in work, my personal resources, the culture and support around me. So it's a consistent process. So I think the frequency with which we can stay aware of how we're feeling has a direct line to how likely it is we are going to be able to prevent degradation, right, symptoms, and the impact of performance as well. Look, having one-to-one and speaking directly to people and making them feel emotionally valued, whether that's in a social context or in a direct workplace, is great. I mean, don't get me wrong, that's fantastic, and I think everyone would say that's a core.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you. I think unless you've got an incredibly psychological safe environment, people sharing that sense of potential failure or I'm not quite hitting the mark, is, particularly if they've been successful, is quite a thing, isn't it? And I think, but it's important to get that. But I guess, what are other ways to ensure that your teams don't go into burnout? I mean, in terms of educational ways, or as I don't know, I know you've got an app within your business as well, which may help.
There's an app for that.
Well, I know it's fun, but do you know what? Apps are really useful. But I'm just thinking, what are the ways? Because I think, as much as you can prevent it, but it's spotting it as well, isn't it? And it's recognizing it and educating people, I guess, so they then can self-regulate, but at least managers can then go, actually, I think this person's in a bit of a situation here. We need to do something here.
Three-pronged approach. the individual, the manager, or the local individual, that person's local environment, and then the company and the culture and the working practices and expectations that are set at the level of the leadership. And see, that's something that we kind of can comprehensively help companies address. Education is great to start. For example, we do certain workshops, just that type of thing, right? Explaining experiences, talking about the drivers, etc. If you've got the time available for that, is important, because there's, again, just like with any type of condition, we saw this with mental health campaigns, just getting awareness of the concept is really important. So that's kind of number one. People forget a lot of things after they've learned them. And so at the individual level, the task is building up a practice or a habit of self-awareness around specific signals, which have to do with how your body and your mind obviously are responding to these feeling and then responding to signs of stress. And then you have that kind of values alignment and emotional component as well. And so at level, we talk about mood, are you frustrated, right, or not, energy levels, fatigue, calm versus being stressed, and motivation. Where do you sit on all those things? Okay. And you can start to become sensitive to changes. If you think highly motivated, feeling lots of energy, feeling high mood and totally calm, great, right? You start to feel a buildup of stress. It's an interesting question. Let's look at this, right? Do I need to just take a time step back? Do I need to minimize my workload? Do I need to reprioritize? Right? Yeah. And then you can kind of take down things. So that's one. And then I think from the team and manager perspective is, again, just around the awareness piece, again, that's also a training to be able to spot people right when you can. However, in terms of mechanisms to allow people to, especially in a centralized environment, both reflect, share that information, and then perhaps also share what are the drivers of that, or what is the support that I need, or the thing that is causing me to feel stressed, the thing that's causing me to feel tired, the thing we call them at level blockers. That's an important component as well. So just to specifically talk about what we're doing with Level is actually building a platform that helps you scale emotional awareness, not only how you're feeling, but also what is potentially stopping you from thriving anonymously, easily across companies. So that then as a manager, as a team together, or as a company leader, you can actually start to spot patterns as to what the underlying root causes are that if you address are alleviating the binding constraint to someone actually being able to have that level of balance and work that they need.
Brilliant. So this app then, from an individual perspective, gives them a bit of a prompt, I guess, from them, stuff they key in, tells them where they're at, and then I guess there's the historical view of that. I guess is that how it would work?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So self-reflection, a little bit of a kind of score of where you sit, historical view.